Before Gettysburg, before Antietam, before the Wilderness or Cold Harbor, there was Shiloh. On April 6th and 7th, 1862, Union and Confederate armies collided in the woods of southwestern Tennessee in a battle whose scale shocked the American public. But the enormous casualties at Shiloh were not simply the result of two armies determined to destroy one another. They exposed serious problems with intelligence, battlefield tactics, adaptability, and command. And at the center stood two generals whose legacies would move in dramatically different directions: Sidney Johnston and Ulysses S. Grant. Shiloh did more than shock a nation. It gave America an early and horrifying glimpse of what the Civil War was becoming. By the spring of 1862, the war in the Western Theater was moving rapidly in the Union's favor. Fort Henry had fallen, then Fort Donelson. Those victories opened critical waterways into the Confederate interior and helped establish Ulysses S. Grant as one of the Union's rising commanders. Grant's Army of the Tennessee now gathered near Pittsburg Landing along the Tennessee River. Meanwhile, another Union army under Don Carlos Buell was marching to reinforce him. For Confederate General Sidney Johnston, the danger was obvious. If Grant and Buell united, the Confederates would confront an enormous combined force capable of pushing even deeper into the South. Johnston, therefore, decided to strike first. His concept was strategically sound: defeat Grant before Buell could arrive, then turn against Buell separately. On April 3rd, Johnston summarized the urgency in a dispatch to Confederate President Jefferson Davis. Quote, "Hope engagement before Buell can form junction," end quote. In just 6 words, Johnston identified the strategic problem facing him. He had to attack, and he had to do it quickly. But transforming that plan into battlefield success would prove far more difficult. Shiloh would become a brutal case study in what Civil War armies could and could not do effectively. One of the most remarkable things about the Confederate attack is that the warning signs are already there. Union troops had observed Confederate activity before the battle. There had been encounters with enemy soldiers, reports from the front, and even prisoners taken. Yet those pieces of intelligence failed to produce the necessary response. Grant had discouraged his troops from initiating a major engagement before Buell arrived, and William Tecumseh Sherman, whose division occupied part of the forward Union position, expressed just how little danger he believed they faced. Sherman said that he did, quote, "not apprehend anything like an attack," end quote. He was about to discover otherwise. The Union Army was encamped with an offensive campaign in mind rather than preparing to repel an immediate assault. Grant expected to be the attacker. Instead, Johnston was coming for him. The Confederates understood that time was critical. Buell was approaching with roughly 37,000 troops, and every delay increased the possibility that he would join Grant before Johnston could strike. But the Confederate Army had its own problems. Moving tens of thousands of relatively inexperienced soldiers through wooded terrain produced confusion, congestion, and delays. Johnston's entire strategy depended upon speed, yet his army struggled to provide it. Nevertheless, shortly before dawn on April 6, Confederate troops began their attack and achieved a devastating degree of surprise. Union soldiers were driven from their camps as Confederate forces pushed them steadily back toward Pittsburg Landing. But surprise was not enough. As the battlefield expanded, formations became disorganized. Commanders lost control of units, and Union resistance began to stiffen. Shiloh had already demonstrated its first important lesson: intelligence only matters when commanders recognize its significance and act upon it. By late morning, the Confederate advance had begun to slow. One of the most famous areas of resistance developed around what became known as the Hornets' Nest and Sunken Road. Here, remnants of several Union divisions established a stubborn defensive position using terrain, infantry fire, and artillery to their advantage. Confederate forces repeatedly attacked it and repeatedly failed. Braxton Bragg ordered assault after assault against Union defenders who possessed both cover and well-positioned artillery. The underlying assumption was common to 19th century warfare. Aggressive infantry, properly motivated and pushed forward with sufficient determination, could overwhelm the enemy. At Shiloh, that assumption carried an enormous human cost. Colonel Randall Gibson of the 4th Louisiana had personally experienced what those attacks were accomplishing. He later described, quote, the strong and almost inaccessible position of the enemy, his infantry well covered in ambush, and his artillery skillfully posted, end quote. His conclusion was damning. The position, quote, was found to be impregnable to infantry alone, end quote. Yet the attacks continued. Eventually, Confederate General Daniel Ruggles tried something different. Instead of simply committing more infantry, Ruggles concentrated artillery against the Union position, assembling what amounted to a small Napoleonic grand battery, possibly involving as many as 62 cannon. The pressure increased dramatically, with Confederate forces threatening their flanks and concentrated artillery pounding their position. Union General Benjamin Prentiss and roughly 2,200 men eventually surrendered. The Hornets' nest had fallen. But how it fell is more important than the simple fact that it did. Repeated frontal assaults had failed at an enormous cost. Concentrated firepower combined with pressure against the Union flanks finally broke the position. Shiloh demonstrated something that armies throughout the Civil War would repeatedly have to learn. Courage could not compensate indefinitely for bad tactics. Adaptability mattered. Shiloh also dramatically reshaped the reputations of the two principal commanders. Albert Sidney Johnston entered the battle regarded as one of the Confederacy's finest soldiers. His reputation in the South was extraordinary. His son, William Preston Johnston, later recalled that when his father came to Richmond, he was, quote, welcomed with a spontaneous outburst of popular enthusiasm, end quote. That reputation would become even greater after his death. While personally directing troops on April 6, Johnston was wounded and bled to death. His death created one of the Civil War's enduring questions. What if Albert Sidney Johnston had survived? Later lost cause interpretations sometimes elevated Johnston into the commander who might have won Shiloh, or perhaps even altered the course of the war. But his actual performance deserves closer examination. Johnston possessed a potentially effective strategic plan, yet his army failed to execute it on schedule. And his decision to personally involve himself in frontline tactical leadership raises another question. Should the commanding general of an entire army have been directing individual troops or overseeing the battle as a whole? Grant's experience was almost the reverse. He had been surprised. His army had not been properly prepared for defense. And by any reasonable measure, April 6 had begun disastrously. But Grant possessed a quality that would eventually define his military career. He refused to accept that a setback automatically meant defeat. His army bent. It suffered horrendous casualties, but it did not break. By evening, Buell's reinforcements were arriving, and on April 7th, the Union counterattacked. The Confederates were driven from the battlefield. Grant would later describe exactly what those 2 days had been like. Quote, Shiloh was the severest battle fought at the West during the war, and but few in the East equaled it for hard, determined fighting, end quote. Coming from Grant, a man who would eventually see the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor, that assessment carries considerable weight. But Shiloh revealed something larger than Grant's personal resilience. It followed Union victories at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. The Confederacy was losing territory in the West, while suffering casualties it could replace only with increasing difficulty. The Union possessed greater reserves of manpower and material. The Confederacy did not. Shiloh therefore offered an early warning of a strategic reality that would become increasingly important. A prolonged war of attrition was a contest the Confederacy could not afford to fight on equal terms. Shiloh did not decide the Civil War. The conflict would continue for another 3 years and produce battles even larger and more destructive. But Shiloh shattered any remaining illusion that this would be a short or relatively bloodless struggle. It exposed failures of intelligence. It demonstrated the terrible consequences of tactical inflexibility. It showed the importance of adapting when battlefield conditions changed. And it offered an early glimpse of two very different command legacies. Albert Sidney Johnston entered Shiloh carrying one of the greatest military reputations in the Confederacy and left it a martyr whose unrealized potential would be debated for generations. Ulysses S. Grant entered as a rising Union general, suffered one of the greatest shocks of his career, and still found a way to win. Most importantly, Shiloh revealed what the Civil War itself was becoming. This would not be a contest decided by one brilliant charge or one decisive battle. It would be a struggle of leadership, intelligence, logistics, manpower, adaptability, and endurance. Grant called Shiloh one of the hardest fought battles of the war. Americans in 1862 did not yet know how much worse the fighting would become. Shiloh was not the bloodiest battle the Civil War would produce, but it was the battle that warned America what was coming. I'm Michael Stroud, and remember, history matters because people matter. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd appreciate it if you would like the video, subscribe to History with Michael Stroud, share it with someone who enjoys history, and leave a comment below. Every like, comment, and share helps more people discover the channel and allows me to continue to bring these stories to life. I release new history documentaries every Tuesday, Thursday, and Sunday, so be sure to click the notification bell so you never miss a new episode. For more historical articles, speaking information, and my latest research, please visit michaelgstroud.com. Thank you again for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode.